I'm Ben Powell, I'm the director of the Free Market Institute here at Texas Tech University. The Free Market Institute was founded in 2013 to promote the study and teaching of free market economics. As part of what we do, we have a lecture series here on campus that does 3 or 4 public lectures per year. I'm very happy that in this particular one, we were able to co-sponsor along with the Institute for the Study of Western Civilization and the Fund for American Studies, a lecture by Ann Bradley, who I'll introduce in just one moment. I should say something about Fund for American Studies, who's one of the co-sponsors where Ann works. They're located in Washington, D.C. For students in the room who might be interested, they do summer internships there where you work in one of the departments in D.C., as well as take a course in politics and another course in economics. In fact, the course I used to teach 3 summers in a row until I got replaced by Dr. Bradley, which also coincided with me moving here to Texas Tech. And Laura is here from the Institute, who's standing in the back end of the door there. If there's anybody interested in a program or an internship in DC, you should see her afterwards. She'll be outside the doors over there or something like that. I'd also just like to say about our next event coming up, before I introduce Ann, that John Stossel, formerly of ABC News and Fox News, will be here for our next speaker. He'll be speaking on freedom and its enemies, and that'll be co-sponsored with the Young America's Foundation and Texas Tech College of Media and Communication. That will be here October 16th at 5:30, but not here, but over in the Student Union Building in one of the larger halls over there. So hopefully some of you can join us for that. It is with great pleasure now that I get to introduce Dr. Ann Bradley. Dr. Ann Rathbone Bradley is the George and Sally Mayer Fellow for Economic Education and Academic Director at the Fund for American Studies. Previously, she served as the Vice President of Economic Initiatives at the Institute for Faith, Work, and Economics, where she did research on a systematic biblical theology of economic freedom, which she visited us 2 or 3 years ago to talk about that project in this same lecture series. But today, she's here to talk about something different related to one of her other previous employers, because she used to be a terrorist analyst at the Central Intelligence Agency, and she had done her dissertation on the economics of terrorism. And today, she's going to be here to talk to us about political economy of terrorism. Ann, welcome back to Texas Tech.
Well, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here again. I always love joining Ben and TFAS together. And to be fair, Ben says I replaced him, but really he nominated me to be his replacement, so it wasn't like a hostile takeover or anything. But I'm really fascinated by this idea of what the economist can bring to the policy discussion of terrorism, which is of course very important. It's a policy conversation in my mind that's not going away anytime soon. And I want to give you a little bit of background as to why I kind of stumbled into this, and it was really stumbling. I was a graduate student with Ben. We entered George Mason University as graduate students at the same time, and that was in 2000. And I was actually living, I'm from the DC area, I'm from Alexandria, and I was living with my parents the first 2 years of graduate school. So when the September 11th attacks happened, and this was before we all had smartphones. We had phones, but I guess they weren't smart at the time. And so, you know, now when you wake up in the morning, you use your phone as an alarm, and you try not to get sucked into the vortex of email right away, and everything is at your fingertips, right? Well, that wasn't the way it was. So I was getting ready to drive to the Fairfax campus for class, and I hadn't turned on a radio, and I didn't have my email on my phone, so I didn't know what was going on. And I got in my car and turned on the radio, because I guess back then we listened to the radio in ways that we don't even do anymore. And I heard instantly what was happening, the attacks on the Twin Towers and the attacks on the Pentagon, and I turned right back around and went home. And I think I did that day what most Americans did, which was stop and just watch TV all day long and wonder where we had gone wrong, what had happened, and what the future held. In fact, I was supposed to attend a Liberty Fund conference, which as a young graduate student, I was very excited to be invited to, and it was canceled indefinitely because all the airports were closed for a week. And all conferences that were supposed to happen, I assume, didn't happen, or they didn't happen when they were supposed to. So at the time at George Mason, I was working with Charles Rowley, who is a law and economics and a public choice scholar, and he was the editor of a journal called Public Choice, which is still very active today. And he said, I'm going to do a special edition dedicated to the topic of terrorism because economists need to be out front on this issue because we have something we can say. We have a method of analysis to offer that's important. And not just important, but if it gets ignored, we're going to make a lot of bad policy decisions. And he was right. So he said, do you want to co-author a paper? And by the way, if you're thinking of going to grad school, if you're in grad school, and your professor says, hey, I'm going to give you this opportunity to write a paper and it's guaranteed publication, you just say yes. It doesn't matter what the topic is. I had never thought when I went into graduate school that I would be fascinated by this topic or even thinking about writing about it. So I said, of course I would do this. So we wrote a general paper on terrorism, and that kind of blossomed into what would be my dissertation. And so I'm sharing the fruits of that research with you tonight, which I view as an ongoing research project. But I think what's exciting about it is economics provides us with a framework of analysis to understand things that don't seem economic to the ordinary, kind of viewpoint. And so I think economics, and really some basic principles in economics, have a lot to offer to help us understand what are we supposed to do? And how do we get to a better world? And can we even achieve a world where there is no terrorism? Certainly that's the rhetoric in Washington. That's the rhetoric from the, the military-industrial complex, that if we are given, if we give more chances and more time and more resources and more manpower, we can get to a world that doesn't have any terrorism. And so the question is that even the right premise from which we should start? So that's what I'm going to talk about tonight. And I'm going to leave a little bit of time at the end for Q&A. But my research was on al-Qaeda, so that's really what I'm going to focus on. But again, I think the beauty here is each terrorist organization or group or state sponsor of terrorism, kind of partners in terrorism, I think can benefit from this type of fundamental analysis. And where I start as an economist is really thinking about what we call in economics the human action model. So we're taking the assumptions that we apply to human beings when we study them in a variety of different institutional settings, in firms, how they engage in commerce, what kind of decisions they make, and we're applying those assumptions to terrorists and terrorist groups and terrorist sponsors. So that's kind of where I started out of the gate with my research, was I'm going to use the tools that economics and the assumptions that economics provides me with as an understanding of human action. And so what is that model? Briefly, it's that, again, my point here in bringing up this basic fundamental premise is that we have to start here if we're going to try to understand al-Qaeda, and so that this is relevant for that study. So for humans to engage in action, for them to leave a state of rest, if you will, for them to decide to do anything, they experience a state of uneasiness. So there's something about their current situation that they are not happy with. And the next thing that has to happen is they have a vision for a better outcome. So a very simple example, you wake up in the morning, you're uneasy about the empty stomach that you have, right? And your body gives you signals that you are hungry. And so what do? You have a vision for a world where you can relieve the hunger. And what do? You take conscious and purposeful steps to get there. Now, all of this happens under a lot of uncertainty, and it happens with fallible human beings who make all different types of errors. They have lapses in judgment. They have bad motivations sometimes. But what is the universal truth of human action? That human beings are doing this to the best of their ability. So when I started my research, this was the model that I used. And that was kind of counterintuitive at the time. It's certainly not what you were hearing coming out of Washington. In fact, if you kind of go back and look at the news as it was coming out right after 9/11, the narrative was terrorists are crazy. They're not like us. They're different than us. They want to, kind of destroy Western civilization. Some of those things may be true. But the idea that they're crazy is a troubling starting point, and for a couple of reasons. One, if they're crazy, you can't fix crazy. You have to shoot crazy or arrest crazy, but you can't change the behavior if it's crazy. right? And so my point here was that maybe there's something about terrorism, there's some purposeful behavior. We don't have to agree with the outcomes or the goals or the desires of terrorists to understand that they're operating within some kind of framework like this. So that's where I started. And I wanted to take that kind of knowledge of economics and I wanted to say, okay, we're going to use the framework of supply and demand to understand why al-Qaeda, why then, what constrains them, and what motivates them. Because if the ultimate answer in our policy conversations is that we want less al-Qaeda, or we want zero al-Qaeda, or we want zero terrorism in general, then we have to start from why is this a choice that seems reasonable in somebody's calculus. And I think going to a very fundamental, very principled supply and demand model brings forth questions that we wouldn't otherwise bring up, that I think, again, are necessary and important questions to ask if we're going to get to a better outcome. So what are the assumptions I'm bringing to the table here is that terrorism has a downward sloping demand curve, which means what? It's somehow responsive to price. Okay, and terrorism has an upward sloping supply curve, right? Meaning the opposite, right? There's a positive relationship here with price and output. So I wanted to use that framework to say, how can I figure out who are the suppliers of al-Qaeda style terrorism in 2001? And who are the demanders of terrorism? See, there's a really important aspect of the economic way of thinking that comes out of this, or that is maybe the basis of this, which is that in a market setting, supply responds to demand. My friend always says supply is demand in disguise, meaning supply is a response to what suppliers think demanders want. That it doesn't happen in isolation, it doesn't happen in a vacuum, it happens as a response to a perceived problem. So again, that's my framework for saying, okay, what is al-Qaeda responding to, and who has a willingness or a desire to pay for the services that al-Qaeda provides? And that's a big set of questions, of course, that takes a lot of thoughtful analysis, and we're not going to be able to do all of that tonight, but that's my starting point. Knowing that analyzing al-Qaeda is not as easy as understanding the market for a Starbucks latte. I'm not trying to oversimplify at all. But what I am doing is saying this economic framework is going to allow me to understand the real policy question that I think we're all after, which is, what does it look like to live in a world where terrorism is really expensive? Because that's what we're after, right? We want to live in a world where terrorism as an activity, as an investment, as something that somebody devotes their time and resources to is expensive, meaning it's a high opportunity cost activity. So if we ask that question, then we're able and we're set up to say, okay, what would that world look like? How can I change incentives so that behavior changes follow? So the first part of that is doing comparative institutional analysis. We have to understand that terrorism is context dependent. It doesn't happen in a lab or in a vacuum, right? It happens because of a certain institutional environment, and I wanted to know what that looked like. So again, knowing the institutions of al-Qaeda, especially when they began, I'll tell a little bit of history about that in a minute. Understanding the constraints faced by the actors involved in this terrorism, and that's not just the terrorists, but it's the people who are combating terrorism. What are the incentives that they face? And is there a world where we can shift the incentives of those parties? And then again, we can use economic thinking to understand that terrorist behavior, even when groups have different motivations, when they do different things, that this framework allows us a way to go from terrorist group to terrorist group and understand what they're doing, what the consequences are, what are the constraints that they face, what are they actually after, and how and if, can we change those things? What influence can the rest of the world have on, kind of the terrorist activity that's currently underway in Iraq or Afghanistan, for example? So that's what I want to do here. So part of this, and if you look at the terrorism literature, you can spend hours and hours and hours reading debates over how we define terrorism. So this is kind of a sophisticated thing to do, I guess. There's a lot of debates, and I think it's important to get your operating definition to be as accurate as possible and as narrow as possible, because you don't want to get into a situation, and you can see how this happens in the policy space, where we define every kind of violent activity that we don't like as terrorism, because that's not an accurate working definition. So what do we mean here? First thing that I'm putting on the table is that kind of what I've said before, but using different words, it occurs within the constraints of cost-benefit analysis. What do terrorists want to do? They want to be good terrorists. What does that mean? They want to find the least costly path to obtain, achieve, and execute their goals. That's what they're doing. So they're weighing the costs and the benefits of their different activities. I think it's dangerous, and again, the literature that spends a lot of time, especially right after 9/11, you see a lot of literature coming out, and it's trying to kind of prototype a terrorist. Can we look at certain things and say, well, if you're from this country, and you're from this religion, and you're this gender, and you're from this income distribution, then you're going to be a terrorist? And what we found is that it's not that easy. There's no kind of universal indicators that help us understand, well, this person, if they're born in this place and they're, whatever, is going to be a terrorist. So there's not a unicausal explanation that gives us kind of a blanket way to preemptively identify terrorists, because I worked at the CIA for a little bit, and that's what they do. That's what they do there. Intelligence is always reactive. We're trying to gather information after it's already happened and put the pieces together. So when I worked at the CIA, I worked in terror finance. And what we were trying to do is and of course, how did we do this? We relied on intelligence that was gathered on the ground and sent to us as analysts. That information is spotty, imperfect, hard to decipher, because terrorists are smart. They don't pick up the cell phone and talk to each other about their plans. They use code language. They transfer resources in very hidden ways. So it's not easy to find them. But what we were trying to do is figure out, if we could track the resources, what they were up to, and preempt it. So my organization within the CIA worked with the US Treasury Department to try to ascertain if we could find an organization that was sponsoring financially or helping facilitate the transfer of resources, we would freeze their assets. And again, this is all reactive, right? So we're always reacting to what's already happened. So it's very important to know what are you seeking to find, and how are we defining this, okay? So it's not unicausal. It happens within the environment of cost and benefit analysis, and looking at the institutional environment in which different terrorist groups emerge and are, what I would say, successful, because that's their goal. Terrorism can be actualized by individuals. We tend to talk about lone wolf terrorists, but it's most often executed in small groups. Now, there's a lot of different, I don't want to kind of stereotype. So again, my background is in researching and looking at al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda has changed a lot. I'm going to talk about that. But I think the point here is that it's not all lone wolves. Usually even lone wolves identify with a brand or try to connect to another group. So that's kind of what we're looking at here. And terrorists distinguish their targets. They're very specific, and in many cases, they're attacking non-aggressors. So we're separating out warfare. We're not looking at, we're trying to separate out, when we look at terrorism, to the extent possible, not state-sponsored terrorism, but independent terrorist groups. How do they get their resources? What are their missions? And how are they successful? And again, what incentives do they face? And in knowing that, can we make progress towards defeating them? So a little bit of background on al-Qaeda and why this comes to be important. So this is the case study that I'm sharing with you tonight. Of course, there's many other we can do, including, I think, knowing the emergence of ISIS, kind of today's, one of the most lethal, although has suffered a lot of setbacks, terrorist group. I think this framework could help us there as well. So if you go back to US Middle Eastern policy, and I bring this up for a very specific reason, and I'll get there. We can start with the Carter Doctrine, which is where I'm starting, but it really goes back to the politicization of crude oil, which becomes very important after World War II. okay, and the consumer usage of oil in new ways. So oil becomes a politicized commodity, okay, and that drives a lot of these foreign policy doctrines. So the Carter Doctrine starts in 1980. It's at his State of the Union address where he announces this, and the idea is that there's going to be no outside influence in the Persian Gulf. So there's a concern about the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which begins in 1979, and there's a whole initiative around that. So the Carter Doctrine begins with an active presence and an active allocation of resources dedicated to that region to protect U.S. and Western interests in the area. This is then facilitated by the Reagan Doctrine, and the Reagan Doctrine doubles down on the Carter Doctrine, and it allocates resources to aid Soviet-resistant forces abroad. Okay, and this is really important to the story of al-Qaeda because Osama bin Laden comes up through this time, and he's part of the Soviet resistance, okay, in Afghanistan at that time in the late 70s and into the 80s. So the Reagan Doctrine is about particularly aiding Soviet resistant forces, and a lot of money is spent on these programs, $20 billion plus military equipment, Stinger missiles, credit for military purchases. So this is not where it starts, but this is really important to the emergence of al-Qaeda, because what's really fascinating about a group like al-Qaeda is they start as this kind of ragtag team of friends who kind of have some weapons. They're very outspoken, but they don't really have any power at the time. And so they go from forming al-Qaeda in 1988 to 2011, or 2001, September 11, 2001, to executing one of the most successful terrorist attacks on US soil. So, I was struck by how such a small group, with at the time not a lot, a lot of resources, but nothing compared to what Hezbollah, to what ISIS had before, a year ago. So that we're talking about billions of dollars. Al-Qaeda at the time of 9/11 had about a $30 million a year operating budget. So the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan goes from 1979 to 1989. The CIA engages in what's called Operation Cyclone, which begins in 1980. This starts to dedicate a lot of resources. At the time, at the beginning, the onset in 1980, it's about $20 to $30 million a year. And at the end, by 1987, it's about $630 million a year. About 100,000, and these funds, by the way, were channeled through the Pakistani intelligence agency known as the ISI, and trained about 100,000 people, and kind of gave them resources, weapons, training, things like this to fight the Soviets. So this was all a cooperation with the CIA and the Pakistani intelligence service to fight the Soviet invasion. So this is just a picture here of some of those meetings. You can see President Reagan in the background. Al-Qaeda formally is founded in 1988 by 3 people. So Osama bin Laden, Abdullah Yusuf Azzam, and al-Zawahiri. Al-Zawahiri is currently the leader of al-Qaeda. The other 2 are dead, as you, I'm sure, know. Osama bin Laden was killed in 2011. And actually, Azzam, who was a spiritual mentor to bin Laden earlier in his life, was killed before 9/11. He was killed with a car bomb in 1989. This picture at the bottom here is a picture of a Pakistani journalist who's interviewing Osama bin Laden, and this is after the expulsion of the Soviets. That gun that's proudly hanging in the background is one of the Russian guns that was captured. So there was, at that point, a lot of interface, a lot of discussion about what al-Qaeda was going to be. In 1988, Osama bin Laden issues an 8,000-word document statement about the goals of al-Qaeda, which include expelling Western influence, right? The condemnation of the House of Saud, Saudi Arabia, which is his home. It's where he's raised, right? And a desire to restore the caliphate and destroy Israel. So you can see right away, he's very clear about his goals, his desires, and what he's after. Now, there's literature in political science and economics, which I relied on to kind of try to think about, okay, al-Qaeda starts in 1988. They're these, 3 friends. It's basically a paramilitary organization that's small. and it's command and control. They begin in Saudi Arabia. Bin Laden, and that happens in 1988, but in 1992, Bin Laden is kicked out of Saudi Arabia and he moves to Sudan, where he stays until 1996, and international and US pressure got him kicked out of Sudan, and he moves to Afghanistan in 1996. And he, you know, as of course you probably know, the Taliban has a hold in Afghanistan at the time. Al-Qaeda is a competing terrorist group, but works really hard to cooperate with the Taliban. In fact, a couple days before 9/11, one of the Taliban's key leading opponents was assassinated by al-Qaeda as an act of goodwill by al-Qaeda, because they knew, you know, this is what happens when you're a roving bandit. So a roving bandit is, think of a rogue regime who moves from place to place. Now, what are the incentives and the constraints of doing that? When somebody moves place to place, now a lot of it is not desired by al-Qaeda, right? They are getting kicked out of the places where they're trying to create a home base. And so they have to move. But this changes the incentives they face and how they run their organization. So the stationary bandit stays there, right? They try to establish a base of power. But in being stationary, you run the risk of people attacking you, overthrowing you, etc., pillaging your own resources. So what does the stationary bandit have to do? They have to make investments in the environment. Maybe they're even making, you know, kind of making contributions to public goods. And we know this has been true of ISIS, for example. But al-Qaeda in the early days is getting kicked out, so they don't last very long anywhere. So when they get into Afghanistan, they now have to kind of broker relations with other kind of rogue groups, primarily the Taliban, and they engage in this assassination to try to make goodwill. So you can see, too, that when you have a band, you know, these kind of competing bands of bandits, if you will, that poses constraints on the groups themselves. So the stationary bandit has the benefit of making investments, but they have to hold on to the power. And to hold on to the power and to try to protect yourself from overthrow, you have to make investments somehow in the community. The roving bandit doesn't have to do that, but it's high transaction cost, right? Because you're getting kicked out, you have to move around. But, you know, you pillage for a while and then you leave, and then you pillage some more and you leave. So you're not making the same type of investments. So it changes the dynamics and the reputation, what the group does. The resources that the group investments are going to be changed based on this. So we see in the early days, they're popping around to different places. Now, here's, you know, part of my work is just keeping track of all the things that terrorist groups do, which is not very encouraging work, I suppose. But this is just a short list of al-Qaeda's attacks in the early years. And you have to realize, too, when I'm doing my dissertation, it's, you know, I start work on this in 2002. The 9/11 Commission report gets declassified right around that time, and it's like my Bible, because I don't really have anything else to go on. And the 9/11 Commission report is made up primarily of detainee interviews. So there's a lot of gaps, that, you know, there's not a lot of primary sources. It's me kind of taking things as they're coming in the media, trying to verify what I think is reliable information and not. So it was kind of good prep, I guess, for intelligence work, because it's very hard to do. But this is kind of how they're learning by doing. So they're practicing, they're engaging in different activities, they're spending their resources. In 1992, you have the Yemen hotel bombings. 1993 is the first World Trade Center attack. In 1998, embassy bombings in Kenya and Tanzania, 200 people are killed. So this is successful. This is for the terrorist group. Again, what are they trying to do? Maximize their output and minimize their costs. So they're learning and they're practicing and they're recruiting during this time. January 2000, there's a planned but failed attack on a US carrier. And then in October 2000, the USS Cole bombing and British embassy in Yemen, which kills 17 people. And so I mentioned this already, September 9th, just a few days before the September 11th attacks, assassination of Ahmad Shah Massoud, who's a leader in the Northern Alliance in Afghanistan and an adversary of the Taliban. So it was an olive branch extended by al-Qaeda, because what does al-Qaeda know is going to happen after the September 11th attacks? There's going to be an international manhunt for this organization. So you need the protection and you need to cooperate with the already established terrorism groups in that region. So it's going to pay for al-Qaeda to make friends if they can. And there's tensions as you can imagine. The 9/11 attacks, of course, are what they're known for, and as I mentioned, it's what started my whole research program in this. 4 commercial U.S. airlines attacked the Pentagon, the Twin Towers, a field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, which actually was a failure. It was an interrupted attack, right, where the plane crashed. Instead of crashing into another building, it crashed on the ground. Approximately 3,000 people were killed, 6,000 people are injured. And this is the day that really changes U.S. policy towards terrorism in a wholly different direction. It's a day that changes the attitudes of Americans about their safety, about their security, and about the real threat of terrorism in the future. So everything changes on this day. And you can imagine, I wouldn't wish having to endure 9/11 as a president on anyone. Because I think there's a lot of pressures that come on you in that moment by the citizens. Keep us safe, protect us, do something. Okay, and that's exactly what happens. Again, as I mentioned, this is KSM, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. He was captured pretty early after 9/11. And he has been at Guantanamo Bay ever since. So he's been interviewed hundreds and hundreds of thousands of times, I imagine, at this point. And from that, we get the 9/11 Commission report that tells us a little bit about what al-Qaeda was after and what they were trying to do. Now, I will say this, that this is what makes this really difficult. KSM is very proud of September 11th, right? So and he's in prison forever. So, how much embellishment is going on here? You have to kind of weigh some of that information that you're getting. But it seems to be the case that in the interviews over and over and over again, he's remained fairly consistent. These guys were trying to optimize their results. Again, this is kind of me just assuming that they're weighing costs and benefits. We don't have to agree with them. We don't have to like them, but they're not stupid. You don't pull off 9/11 if you're not strategic, if you're not organized, right? If you're not running a tight ship in your organization. So we need to understand that and the motivations around that. Again, my bigger question is, what gets us out of that? How do we change all this? So this is something fascinating that I didn't think anybody or people weren't talking about enough, and I remember uncovering this in my research. If you look at the report, the 9/11 Commission report, the way 9/11 happened was not the original desire of the leadership of al-Qaeda. The original desire of the leadership of al-Qaeda was that there would be a simultaneous global attack, one on the east coast of the United States and one simultaneously in Japan. One can imagine the fear that globally, the global panic that would have ensued had they been successful in that desire. I don't even want to imagine that. I assume you don't either. And what we know is that that leg of the trip, that leg of the attack, that part of the plan was canceled. And it was canceled because doing it once is hard enough, but doing it twice simultaneously before everybody shuts down all the airports. I just read a really interesting story. These stories tend to come out on the anniversary, when we get close to the anniversary of 9/11. After the attacks on the Twin Towers, there were planes in the air, right? Lots of them. And those planes had to get out of the air immediately. So there was some Canadian town that accepted, hundreds of airplanes that were inbound for the United States. And so, this really tiny, small town accepts all these thousands of passengers, and people are sleeping on other people's floors. I mean, it was a real show of humanity. It was neat. But I mean, those are the things you don't think about, is you have 20,000 planes potentially in the sky at any given time, and they have to land somewhere. Right? So had al-Qaeda been able to do Japan and the United States at the same time, they would have been even more productive. This was their desire, this was their goal. But why did they cancel that part of the trip? They canceled that part of the trip because it was just a little bit too far. It was just a little bit too hard, and the chances of being caught and intercepted are higher, the riskier the project, right? So they're taking calculated risks. They're taking calculated risks because they have to, because the worst thing a terror group can do is fail publicly. Failing publicly either gets you killed or gets you arrested and then probably killed. And you don't scare people when you fail. You might scare them a little bit, but you don't scare them as much as if you succeed, and that's part of the goal, right? The goal of this terrorist activity is, I want these 5 policy objectives. You know, I want to restore the caliphate, I want the US out of Middle Eastern politics, et cetera, et cetera. I want US alliance with Israel to end. This is all the stuff I want. And if I scare you enough to show you that you can't negotiate with me, that I'm in charge and you're not, then maybe you'll do what I want, right? This is the thinking. So canceling that leg of the trip, I think, was important for their success. Not that we want that. We don't want them to be successful, but it was important. It was strategic. Okay, so if you also read, it's very interesting, if you read the 9/11 Commission report on the actions that were taken by the hijackers, who were very well trained. By the way, the 9/11 hijackers came into the United States on legal visas. They were pilots in training, and there were very specific rules from al-Qaeda to these hijackers about what they were supposed to do and then what they were not supposed to do. And what I find interesting, if you read this stuff, here's part of what they were supposed to do. Get a job, get a gym membership, have a beer after work with somebody, get a girlfriend. Those all sound like lovely things, right? Who doesn't like a beer after, maybe beer after the gym, not before, I don't know. But the point is, they wanted them to fill in. They wanted them, or to blend in, to assimilate, to not look like outsiders. You got to play the game, right? You have to get yourself embedded into the environment and look like you belong there. But the top leadership was very specific about not allowing the hijackers to stay too long. Why might that be? Because having a gym membership and a job and a girlfriend and a beer is awesome. So the problem that al-Qaeda has, this is the high risk part of this attack, is that the top leadership is far away. They've trained them, they've prepped them, they've kind of sequestered them from their families. They've been trained to do this military-style training to take this action. But the longer they're removed from their superiors, the more possibilities, right, of aborting the procedure. And the leadership knew that and took steps to try to make sure that wasn't going to happen. So they were very aware of the risks of all of this. Sorry, I almost skipped this. I think this is really important. So right after 9/11, again, I wouldn't wish this on anybody, but this is George Bush. He goes down with an American flag in hand. He goes to ground zero, and he says this: our war on terror begins with al-Qaeda, but it does not end there. It will not end until every terrorist group of global reach has been found, stopped, and defeated. So we enter into an endless war with potentially, if you look at that language and you take it literally, an unlimited amount of resources that are going to be dedicated to not only stopping al-Qaeda. This is not just about al-Qaeda. It's about every terrorist group of global reach. So this is a tall order. It's a very difficult policy goal. And so the question that The Economist says is, we're just going to take him at his word that he means that with the best of intentions, which of course he does. But The Economist, what they bring to this discussion is it possible to use policy to do that? Because modern terrorism takes new forms and shapes, but terrorism is not new to the human condition. So as long as human beings have lived alongside of each other, they've terrorized each other in different ways. And the question is, and I always say, you know, kind of life in the 21st century is like winning the lottery, the historical lottery. We live in a time generally of great wealth and great peace. And so there is a way to get to a world where there's less of this. I'm not sure there's a way to get to a world where there's zero of this. I don't think that's the right question. And I think it requires pretty much infinite resources. So, and maybe we say, okay, well, we don't have to take him literally. But then the question comes from, you know, the policy issues start to emerge right away. Well, what does good look like? Does it look like fewer financial resources that al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups are able to acquire? Is it a reduction in their efficacy? Is it an increase in our strategic defense? What is good? What does good look like? So these are really difficult questions that are asked, and it unleashes an immense amount of resources that are dedicated to this. So, remember I talked about the supply and demand. We want to think of al-Qaeda or ISIS or whatever, you know, kind of whatever organization you may be interested in. What are the goals, and who's willing to pay for those things to happen? So the funding sources of al-Qaeda in the early years, al-Qaeda has shifted a lot, I'm going to get to that in a minute, but the personal fortune of Osama bin Laden helps get the organization going. Remember, it's a small group of people at first. Top-down leadership of party of 3, and then very small cells that are organized in response to that leadership. But so they rely on his personal fortune, drug trafficking and the heroin trade, regional donors and charities. And this is a picture that was acquired in a raid in 2002 with an early list of al-Qaeda funders. It's called the Golden Chain. So if you look at who's on this, bankers, businessmen, former ministers. And at the time, it's estimated that al-Qaeda operated on a budget of about $30 million a year, which is not a lot of money for kind of a nonprofit organization, for a paramilitary organization. $30 million a year is not a lot. It's estimated, of course, retroactively, that it costs about $500,000 to make 9/11 happen. And so, so when you look at it that way, you say, wow, gosh, you don't really have to have that many resources, and to be successful, you don't need a lot of people, and you don't need a lot of money. That begs the question, should we expect all sorts of different terror groups to be popping up? Is al-Qaeda's success going to spur more groups to take this type of activity to achieve their economic, political, religious, etc., their goals? So because if that's true, that's a problem, and it becomes a policy problem, and we need a way to address that problem, right? Again, going back here, just to reiterate it again, I'm still operating on this. So I'm thinking about, okay, who are the type of people that are willing to pay for terrorism? And if you look at the Golden Chain, you see, of course, that these are not necessarily people who are living destitute lives, former ministers, bankers, businessmen. So relative to the people that live amongst them, they're wealthy, they're educated. So there's, this kind of, again, flies in the face of all the things that people thought right after 9/11, which was terrorists are poor, terrorists are uneducated, et cetera. And then that, if we can kind of identify this stereotype of a terrorist, we can go after and find them, or find people who might join a terrorist group. And so I think if you look at the policy response that's happened in light of 9/11, here's what I'm going to say now, and I'll get to more of it in a little bit. I think our policies have been well-intentioned, so we're not questioning the intentions of people in the U.S. government. But what my kind of summary statement here is that it's focused on the supply curve. It's focused on the supply of terrorism. So right after 9/11, what happens? You raise the defenses at airports, at ports. You rethink immigration strategy. That's defense, right? That's a defensive reaction. This is what happened to us last time. They use airplanes to run into buildings. They might do that again. So let's raise our defenses and increase the cost of them doing that. It's an attempt to push back the supply curve. Maybe that's necessary. It probably is, but what I'm saying to you is it's not sufficient. It's not sufficient. And you only, I think, get that if you're embracing this economic way of thinking. Because if there's an active demand for the activities of al-Qaeda and ISIS and Hamas and every other terrorist group, then there's going to be people who find a way to make it happen. So I think part of the solution, and the title of the talk is Economic Freedom as a Countermeasure. So what we need to do is not just deal with the symptoms of terrorism, but the causes of terrorism. So yes, if you can make it harder for terrorists to transfer money, and you can do that in a low-cost way, by all means do it. But life finds a way. If you've seen the movie Jurassic Park, that's my favorite line. Life always finds a way. So we can raise the cost of doing it, but if the impetus for doing that thing goes unchecked, the thing will still happen. And we don't want to get into a situation where we're just chasing that. So al-Qaeda is organized like a quasi-firm bureau, centrally managed through top-down leadership. This is the early days, right? So this is from the onset of 1988. They have to recruit and entice members. In some cases, we believe that people who would ultimately be suicide bombers, that would be the hijackers, that their families were given payments. So there was knowledge that this was going to be the end game for some of them. The firm is responsible to their donors. So we want to think about who are the customers here. You know, when I was at the CIA, the most fascinating thing that I always wanted to be writing about was, you know, it is somewhat interesting to think about somebody who would decidedly and rationally, with forethought, get into an airplane and kill themselves in the process of trying to hurt other people. But I think what's really interesting are the people who would never do that, but will write a check. What are those people after? Are they the customers that we seek to try to understand? What do they want al-Qaeda to be successful at doing? Do they want al-Qaeda to restore the caliphate so they can have political control? I mean, there's a lot of questions there. So I wanted to try to understand that. This is not, again, we're not talking about going into the grocery store and buying an apple, right? When you're buying the services of al-Qaeda, you're not paying a per unit price. So we're not looking at something that you buy and sell in a regular market. So the output is not sold, and it has public good characteristics to it, or maybe we should call it public bad. So you cannot engage in terrorism. You can sit around and watch it and listen to it on the radio and have extremely high utility from the fact that it occurred. Why? What are those folks after? What do they want? What do they desire? And then kind of, I was trying to figure out who are the workers, who are the donors, who are the customers, and how much overlap is there. And so, of course, because we have a lot of intelligence gaps, we don't know all of those things. But it seems that the workers and the donors are largely separate groups of people. The donors to al-Qaeda, at least in the early years, were people who would not themselves engage in a suicide act of terrorism, but would fund it. So they want it to happen, but they're not willing to do it themselves. The workers are recruited, enticed, incentivized. They have quasi-employment contracts, and they are provided for. So there's club goods or collective goods that are being exchanged. There's a community that's forming around being part of al-Qaeda that's important for al-Qaeda to be successful. So the al-Qaeda leadership in the early years is directing everything. Okay, they tried to, from what we know, again, the cells were small. In some cases, maybe 11, maybe 12, maybe 8 people. The cells were specialized, different types of training, different types of specialization and job functions that they were being trained to do. Information was on a need-to-know basis, so the leadership told you what to do and you did it, you didn't question it. Information that was gathered on the ground was reported back to the top leadership. So the cells were small and discrete. There wasn't a lot of overlap, meaning you don't know what you're on a need-to-know basis. Al-Qaeda has changed dramatically since about 2004. Al-Qaeda now is more like an umbrella organization. So it's a franchise. It's not a small unit that's top-down command and control. Rather, there's 4 groups who have pledged a bayat, or a pledge to al-Qaeda. And these are the 4 groups, and these are the dates. So it's al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, al-Shabaab, and al-Nusra Front. So these are 4 groups. They have a lot of autonomy. It's not command and control, but they've pledged an allegiance to al-Qaeda. So when the terrorism research is conducted, the activities of these groups are lumped into how we're measuring the size, the scope, the money that al-Qaeda has. But then it gets a little bit more complicated because there's at least 40 other active groups that have loose affiliations with al-Qaeda. The story, frankly, of ISIS is that it used to be al-Qaeda in Iraq, and in about 2014, total separation of the groups. In fact, again, from what we know, it suggests that al-Qaeda wanted ISIS to stop some of its activity. Too violent, too extreme, too disruptive, going to bring in the forces, going to bring in the troops. And of course, last year, that's exactly what we saw. So there's a big reduction in the power of ISIS in the last year, and Boko Haram for those reasons. So I've been given my 5-minute warning, so I'm going to try to wrap it up here. One thing I want to show you, just as I wrap it up so we can have some questions. The question that I think we need to ask, and part of what I have in my title is, I think economic freedom is part of the solution. It's a hard thing to come by. You can't snap your fingers and get economic freedom in a place. If we could, we would do that. Economic freedom, for those who aren't familiar with that term, means things like the rule of law, the respect for property rights, the freedom to engage in trade, the soundness of currency, the rule of law. So if you look at the 4 countries that are the top homes to terrorists, 74% of terrorist attacks and terrorist activity happens in those countries. Pakistan, Afghanistan, okay? So I think if you look at the efficacy of the money that we've invested by the United States government and other partners in the war on terror, it's something like $5,632 trillion or billion dollars. So $5.6 trillion. It's a lot of money spent. If you look at the terrorist attacks in the United States, very few. I think there were, I had a slide here, but in the 2010s, 192 attacks. That's down from 1,400 in the 1970s. So terrorism in the US is on the way down, at least now, but terrorism globally is increased. Now, in the last year or two, it's down about 10%. So the question is, are we trending in that direction? So I think what we have to ask ourselves, again, I go back to the supply and demand curve, it's not enough to try to raise your defenses to stop what terrorist groups are already doing. But rather what we should do is rethink some of the policies we already engage in and try to think about better ways of doing things, okay? So, sorry, I have way too many slides as always. Here's some of my recommendations for what we can do. I think we should encourage regional and international trade opportunities. So trade empowers ordinary people. We can't engage in a US or UN-led policy that says be a free trade zone or be a democracy. It's not that simple. But encouraging trade rather than discouraging it, being cautious about the sanctions that we use and don't use that can harm trade for ordinary people. These are things we should think about. Rethinking the global war on drugs. Okay, the global war on drugs has very important impacts for the power that terrorist groups have in a place like Afghanistan, which is one of the world's largest opium producers. Okay, so I'm not saying, you want all your neighbors to be doing heroin, but what I'm saying is global policies have consequences. And if we're doing it wrong, we need to do it a different way. That's what economics tells us. Okay, so it doesn't mean we just walk away and never do anything again. But it means if terrorists do in fact respond to incentives, then we can envision in a world where terrorism is more expensive. Economic freedom is one way to do that. I'm going to stop so we can have at least a few questions. It's a hard stop. Thanks. Sorry.